Rowan Hale handed back the Gulfstream after 6 months of rebuilding it piece by piece. Chief Executive Vivian Blackthorne looked at the final invoice, laughed once, and tore the contract apart in front of her entire board. She announced that she would not pay him a single dollar for his work. Rowan did not argue or raise his voice. He set his technical certification card on the table and walked out of the hangar without another word. 2 hours later, her chief pilot refused to start the engines. One by one, every pilot on the Blackthorne roster stepped off the aircraft because they understood a secret that Vivian herself had never bothered to read. Subscribe to this channel now so you never miss the moment. A quiet single father forces an entire aviation empire to kneel before the truth. Long before Vivian Blackthorne ever set foot in his hangar, Rowan Hale had built a quiet reputation among a small circle of operators who cared more about precision than prestige. He kept his shop lean on purpose, refusing to grow past the point where he could personally inspect every major repair before it left his hands. Clients who wanted speed above all else usually found their way to larger facilities with glossier waiting rooms and faster turnaround promises, while the ones who wanted the work done right eventually found their way to him. He rarely advertised, relying instead on word passed quietly between pilots, mechanics, and insurance adjusters who had seen his standards up close. It was exactly that reputation, built patiently over years, that eventually reached a Blackthorne fleet manager, searching for someone willing to take on an aircraft everyone else had already given up on. The Gulfstream arrived at Hale Aero Restoration nearly 9 months earlier, towed in on a flatbed trailer under a gray California sky, looking less like a private jet and more like a casualty of war. 2 larger maintenance centers in the region had already turned the project away, calling the damage too extensive and the timeline too unrealistic to be worth the liability. The rear fuselage had buckled in a hangar accident, the pressurization system had been compromised, and a significant section of the wing structure needed to be rebuilt from the spar outward. Most shops would have simply stripped the airframe for parts and called it a total loss, but Rowan Hale looked at the twisted metal and saw something worth saving. He walked the length of the fuselage with a flashlight and a notepad for nearly 3 hours before he said a single word to anyone waiting outside. When he finally spoke, he told his lead technician that the aircraft could fly again, safely, within 6 months, if they did the work in the right order and never cut a corner to save a week. Vivian had inherited both her fortune and her assumptions from a family that had spent 3 generations building an empire out of aviation, real estate, and investment holdings, and she had rarely, if ever, been told no by anyone she considered beneath her station. She measured people almost entirely by the size of their bank accounts and the polish of their offices, a habit that had served her reasonably well in boardrooms full of people just like her, but one that left her poorly equipped to judge a man who kept his ambitions modest by choice rather than necessity. She arrived at the hangar with an entourage that outnumbered the entire Hale Aero Restoration staff, trailed by assistants, a security escort, and 2 attorneys carrying leather folios. She stepped out of her car in a tailored coat that cost more than most of the equipment in the shop, scanning the grease-stained floor with visible distaste. When she spotted Rowan in his work coveralls, sleeves rolled up and a smudge of hydraulic fluid across one forearm, she assumed he was a junior mechanic and addressed her questions to the man standing beside him instead. It took her assistant clearing his throat twice before she understood that the man in coveralls actually owned the company she had just entrusted with a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Even then, she kept glancing toward Dorian Kessler, her chief financial officer, as though he might be the one who truly understood what was happening. She asked, within earshot of the entire team, whether a man juggling school pickups for a daughter could realistically manage a project of this size and complexity. Rowan let the remark pass without a flicker of reaction, because he had learned years earlier that defending himself to people like Vivian rarely changed their minds and always wasted time better spent on the work itself. He simply asked that any changes she wanted, made to the original repair plan, be submitted in writing so there would be no confusion later about what had been requested and what had been delivered. Vivian waved a hand as if the request were beneath her attention and told Dorian to handle the paperwork however he saw fit. Before she left the hangar that first afternoon, she murmured something to Dorian just loud enough for Rowan to catch, a promise that by the time the aircraft was finished, they would find a way to cut his final payment down by half. Dorian chuckled and reminded her that a single father running a boutique repair shop out of a rented hangar had neither the money nor the appetite to fight a company the size of Blackthorn Global Aviation. Neither of them noticed that Rowan had already begun keeping copies of every email, every voicemail, and every photograph documenting the condition of the aircraft the day it arrived. That instinct proved useful within the first week, when Rowan discovered that the damage did not entirely match the insurance report Blackthorn had submitted. A section of the pressurization system showed signs of prior tampering, wiring that had clearly been rerouted before the hangar accident that supposedly caused all the harm in the first place. When Rowan raised the discrepancy, Dorian pulled him aside and asked, almost casually, whether the detail really needed to appear in the official repair log, since it might complicate the insurance claim Blackthorn had already filed. Rowan told him plainly that anything affecting the safety history of the aircraft would go in the record whether it was convenient or not, and that he would not falsify documentation for any client, regardless of how large their name was. Dorian did not push further that day, but the exchange lodged itself in Rowan's memory the way a hairline crack lodges itself in a wing spar, small and easy to ignore until the day it is not. Over the following months, Rowan led a small, disciplined crew through a rebuild that would have taken most facilities more than a year, working late into the evenings while still finding time for a short phone call to his daughter, Avery, almost every night. She was 19, away at college, and their calls were rarely about anything dramatic, usually just a quick check on whether she had eaten dinner or finished a paper due the next morning. Rowan had raised her mostly alone since her mother passed away when Avery was still in middle school, a stretch of years he rarely spoke about, but that had shaped nearly every decision he made afterward. He had walked away from a lucrative engineering career at that time, trading a corner office and a six-figure salary for a small rented hangar and a schedule flexible enough to make every school recital and every parent conference. Avery never remembered a version of her father who chased titles or bonuses, only a version who came home every night, smelling faintly of jet fuel, and always asked about her day before mentioning anything about his own. That steadiness, forged in the hardest years of his life, was the same quality that now made him immovable in the face of Vivienne Blackthorn's pressure. Vivienne, meanwhile, treated the project less like a repair and more like a personal renovation, sending a steady stream of new requests through Dorian's office. She wanted the interior fabric changed twice, a private conference cabin added where a galley used to be, the satellite communication system upgraded, and the delivery date moved up by nearly 3 weeks to accommodate a business trip she considered non-negotiable. Rowan absorbed each change calmly, insisting only that Dorian confirm every addition through email so there would be a paper trail matching the work being done, though Dorian consistently avoided signing any formal amendment to the original contract. Mara Ellison, the chief pilot for Blackthorn's fleet, began visiting the hangar regularly to check on the aircraft's progress. Initially skeptical that a small independent shop could handle a repair this complex without cutting corners somewhere along the way. She had flown for Blackthorn for nearly a decade, long enough to see several rounds of budget cuts trickle down into shortcuts on maintenance schedules that always made her uneasy, and long enough to develop a strong instinct for spotting a facility that talked a good game without the substance to back it up. Her first 2 visits left her unconvinced, mostly because Rowan answered her technical questions with such plain, unhurried honesty that she assumed at first he was simply being evasive about problems he did not want to admit. What she found instead was a team that treated every rivet and every weld like it mattered, led by a man who seemed to understand the Gulfstream's structure more intimately than the manufacturer representatives Blackthorne had flown in earlier that year. During one inspection, Rowan discovered a hairline crack buried deep beneath an older repair layer, the kind of flaw that would have gone completely undetected if the crew had simply followed the original insurance report and called it a day. Rather than patch over it and move on, he quietly authorized his team to open up a much larger section of the airframe, absorbing the additional labor cost himself rather than sending Blackthorne a change order for something he considered a basic matter of safety. Dorian was furious when he learned about the expanded scope of work, accusing Rowan of manufacturing extra tasks simply to inflate the final bill and squeeze more money out of the company. Rowan responded not with anger but with evidence, laying out ultrasonic scan results, time-stamped photographs, and a written structural analysis explaining exactly why the crack could not be safely ignored. Dorian could not dispute the data, but he pressed Rowan anyway to be, in his words, more flexible about the invoice, reminding him that Blackthorne's continued business could shape the future of his small shop for years to come. Rowan told him, in the same even tone he used for nearly everything, that the aircraft did not care how wealthy its owner happened to be, because metal only understood whether it was safe or whether it was not. It was around this time that Mara noticed Rowan's signature on an older set of structural repair drawings pinned to the wall of his office, drawings that predated Hale Aero restoration entirely and traced back to a major aircraft manufacturer's engineering division. She began to suspect that Vivian Blackthorne had not simply hired a mechanic with a small shop, but had unknowingly hired one of the very engineers who helped design the repair standards the entire industry now relied on. After 6 months of relentless work, the Gulfstream rolled out of the hangar looking nearly indistinguishable from the day it first left the factory floor. Its fuselage polished, its cabin rebuilt, every ground test passed without a single flag. Vivian treated the handover like an internal press event, inviting board members, business partners, and the full flight crew to witness the aircraft's return in person. When Rowan handed the final invoice to Dorian, it included the remaining contract balance, the additional cabin work Vivian had personally requested, the material upgrades, and the structural repair costs tied directly to emails Dorian himself had approved months earlier. Dorian announced, in front of the assembled crowd, that Blackthorne would not be paying the invoice at all, citing a 3-day delay in the delivery schedule as grounds for withholding payment entirely. Rowan calmly pointed out that the delay traced directly back to Vivian's own requested changes to the interior and communication systems, changes documented in writing exactly as he had insisted from the very first week of the project. Vivian did not so much as glance at the paperwork Rowan offered. She took the invoice from Dorian's hands, mocked Rowan for believing that a handful of emails could ever obligate a company worth billions of dollars, and tore the pages in half in front of her entire executive team. She reminded him, loudly enough for everyone in the hangar to hear, that he was nothing more than a mechanic running a rented shop with a skeleton crew, and that if he tried to sue, Blackthorne's legal department could drag the case out for years until his small business simply collapsed under the weight of it. She went further still, mentioning that she understood he had a daughter's tuition to worry about, a detail that made it clear Dorian had done some quiet digging into Rowan's personal life. Rowan asked her only one question in return, calm and direct. Was she formally refusing to complete the handover process as outlined in their contract? When she answered that the aircraft belonged to her and needed no one's permission to fly, Rowan reached into his jacket, placed his technical certification card on the table between them, and quietly began gathering his personal files. He did not argue further, did not threaten legal action in the moment, and did not ask anyone to physically stop the aircraft from leaving the hangar. As he walked out into the afternoon light, Vivian ordered Mara to prepare the Gulfstream for immediate departure, eager to prove that no single contractor, however skilled, could inconvenience her for long. Mara opened the aircraft's completion binder out of habit, flipping toward the final page where the return to service authorization was meant to be signed. The box remained empty, and she stood there for a long moment before quietly closing the binder again. Vivian climbed aboard with Dorian and a handful of assistants, luggage already loaded, ground crew already clearing the tarmac, a flight plan already filed for a morning departure the next day. The cockpit, however, stayed dark and silent. Mara stepped back down the air stairs and told Vivian plainly that she could not fly the aircraft without a signed return-to-service authorization confirming the completion of every safety requirement. Vivian dismissed the concern as pointless bureaucracy and ordered her co-pilot to take the controls instead. The co-pilot reviewed the same binder, reached the same empty box, and gave Vivian the same answer Mara had. 2 additional pilots from the Blackthorn roster were summoned, and each one, after a brief look at the paperwork, declined for identical reasons, unwilling to accept personal responsibility for an aircraft that had not been formally cleared for operation. Dorian, growing desperate, phoned a contract pilot service and offered a fee 5 times the standard rate to anyone willing to fly the jet that same evening. 2 pilots arrived within the hour, reviewed the maintenance log, and walked back to their car without a word of negotiation. One of them paused just long enough to explain that if anything went wrong mid-flight, it would be his license, his career, and potentially far worse resting on his shoulders, not the company's. Vivian, increasingly convinced that Rowan had somehow orchestrated a coordinated mutiny among her flight crew, accused him of turning her own employees against her out of spite. Mara corrected her firmly, insisting that Rowan had never once contacted her, and that every pilot's decision had been made independently, based solely on an unsigned document sitting in an otherwise completed binder. The situation escalated further when the insurance carrier sent formal notice that the aircraft did not qualify for operational coverage without a completed return to service authorization, and that any unauthorized flight would void protection entirely, potentially removing every pilot involved from coverage under the fleet's broader policy. Vivian finally understood that this was no longer a disagreement with a single stubborn vendor, but a structural problem threatening the entire fleet's insurance standing. She tried calling Rowan directly, but he did not answer, sitting instead in his aging pickup truck outside the airfield, listening to Avery describe how her exam had gone that afternoon. He never mentioned that an entire flight crew was quietly refusing to fly for one of the most powerful women in private aviation, saying only that his workday had run a little longer than he expected. Dorian suggested finding another certified engineer willing to sign the authorization in Rowan's place, hoping to sidestep the entire dispute with a simple substitute signature. Vivian declared in front of her assembled pilots that before the sun set, she would prove that any contractor, no matter how skilled, could be replaced without consequence. Mara glanced down at the small card Rowan had left behind on the table, then looked back up and told her quietly that not everyone had the authority to sign that particular document, regardless of how much money was offered. Dorian spent the following morning contacting 3 major maintenance facilities across California, Arizona, and Texas, hoping one of them would agree to certify the aircraft in Rowan's place. The first facility declined outright, unwilling to put its name behind repair work it had played no part in overseeing from the beginning. The second offered to take the project, but only if the crew disassembled large sections of the airframe and rebuilt them entirely from scratch, a process that would take at least 4 additional months and cost several $1 million more. The third facility initially expressed interest until its lead engineer discovered that the repair method used throughout the aircraft belonged to a proprietary structural process developed specifically by Rowan Hale, at which point the facility withdrew from consideration almost immediately. Vivian began to understand, slowly and unpleasantly, that owning a completed aircraft and being able to legally operate it were 2 very different things. Frustrated by the lack of options, Dorian brought in Everett Sloan, an attorney who specialized in corporate crisis response, hoping legal pressure could accomplish what money alone had failed to achieve. Together they drafted a letter demanding that Rowan sign the completion documents within 2 hours, accusing him of unlawfully holding the aircraft hostage and threatening a lawsuit over damages tied to a stalled business deal. The letter further warned that Blackthorn would inform the entire industry that Hale Aero Restoration could not be trusted to complete a contract professionally. Rowan forwarded the letter to his own attorney without a reply, then quietly sent back copies of the original contract, the email chain confirming every additional charge, and a written record of the meeting where Vivian had refused payment outright. He stated clearly that he remained willing to complete final inspection procedures the moment Blackthorn fulfilled its own contractual obligations, nothing more and nothing less. The pressure only intensified when Vivian called Rowan directly, this time offering to pay 20% of the outstanding invoice if he would simply sign the paperwork immediately. When he declined, she raised the offer to 40%, adding a vague promise of future business between their companies. Rowan declined again, his voice steady, until Vivian shifted tactics entirely and suggested that Avery might find it difficult to secure internship placements at any aviation company connected to Blackthorn's extensive business network. For the first time in the entire ordeal, Rowan's tone changed, though he still did not raise his voice. He told Vivian plainly that she was not to mention his daughter again under any circumstances, and that from that point forward every further communication between them would occur strictly in writing. Support for Rowan arrived from an unexpected direction the following day, when Mara circulated a short written statement among the flight crew explaining their position. The document confirmed that no pilot had been pressured or instructed by Rowan to refuse any flight, and that each decision had been made independently, based on professional judgment and a shared commitment to safety. It stated that the crew would resume operating the aircraft only once the legal and technical process had been properly completed, without exception. All 14 pilots on Blackthorn's active roster signed their names to the statement, a level of unified resistance Vivian had never once encountered in her years running the company. That same afternoon, an outside engineer Dorian had quietly consulted called Vivian with troubling news that went beyond the missing signature or the withheld payment. Without the original structural dataset and Rowan's formal confirmation of the aircraft's new operating limitations, the Gulfstream would not simply sit grounded for a few extra days. It risked never being cleared to carry passengers again in any meaningful capacity, regardless of how much money Blackthorn eventually threw at the problem. Forced to confront the scale of what had actually happened, Vivian demanded that Dorian walk her through the entire contract in detail, something she admitted, reluctantly, that she had never bothered to read closely herself. Buried within dozens of pages, They found a lengthy technical appendix Dorian had apparently skimmed without absorbing its significance. The repair method Rowan had used was not a standard, off-the-shelf procedure available from any qualified shop. He had designed an entirely new reinforcement structure specifically to save the aircraft from being scrapped outright, and the appendix detailing that structure came with strict conditions attached. It specified revised load limits for the airframe, a customized maintenance schedule unique to the repair, updated pressurization tolerances, mandatory inspection points tied to specific flight hours, verification data that only Rowan's team possessed, and complete traceability records for every replaced component. Without any single piece of that documentation, no professional pilot, insurance provider, or operator would ever certify the aircraft for use, no matter how polished its exterior appeared. It was during this same stretch of frantic phone calls that Mara quietly revealed something about Rowan's past to the wider management team, information she had pieced together from the drawings she had seen pinned to his office wall months earlier. Rowan had once served as lead structural engineer on a major aircraft manufacturing program, responsible for developing repair techniques that facilities across the industry still relied on today. He had left that high-paying position after his wife passed away, choosing instead to build a small independent practice where he could remain closely involved in raising his daughter. Many of the very repair standards larger shops now used as a baseline had originated from his own engineering work years earlier. He had not opened Hale Aero Restoration because he lacked ambition or skill, but because he refused to return to an environment where sales targets consistently outweighed the judgment of the engineers responsible for keeping people safe. Vivienne had mistaken his quiet, unassuming manner for weakness from the very first afternoon they met, and that miscalculation was now costing her far more than money. Rowan had never set out to build a case against anyone. He simply kept the same habits he had followed his entire career, documenting every decision as though someone might one day need to understand exactly why a particular choice had been made. His technicians teased him occasionally about the thickness of his project binders, joking that he treated routine maintenance logs like courtroom exhibits. That habit, dismissed for years as mere caution, suddenly became the only thing standing between Hale Aero Restoration and a company willing to rewrite history in its own favor. When his attorney reviewed the files Rowan handed over, she told him plainly that she had rarely seen a small contractor keep records this complete, and that the discipline would likely save him months of drawn-out litigation. Evidence against Dorian continued to mount as well, particularly once Thaddeus Kingsley, the chairman of Blackthorn's board, learned that the company's flagship aircraft could not legally leave the ground. He ordered an immediate review of the entire repair project, demanding full transparency from both Vivienne and Dorian regarding how the situation had spiraled this far out of control. Rowan sent the board a complete file directly, including the emails in which Dorian asked him to omit evidence of prior tampering from the official repair log. The file also contained records of Vivienne's numerous change requests, documentation of the dangerous crack discovered mid-project, proof that Rowan had absorbed additional costs himself to meet proper safety standards, an audio recording of the meeting where Vivienne formally refused payment, and the written record of her veiled threat involving Avery's future career prospects. The board quickly understood that Vivienne was not merely locked in a dispute with a single vendor. She had placed the company's aircraft, insurance standing, and public reputation at serious risk through her own conduct. Time pressure compounded the crisis further, since Vivienne was scheduled to fly to New York the following morning to finalize an important business deal that had taken months to arrange. No comparable aircraft could be secured on short notice, since every suitable jet in the region had already been booked for a major industry conference happening the same week. Vivian instructed Mara to prepare a smaller aircraft from the fleet instead, one that happened to be in the middle of mandatory scheduled maintenance. Mara refused outright, unwilling to bypass a required safety check simply to accommodate her employer's travel schedule. When Vivian pushed harder, insisting the maintenance could wait until after the trip, Mara removed her employee badge and set it on the table, stating she was prepared to resign rather than gamble with anyone's safety to preserve a chief executive's calendar. Thaddeus Kingsley called an emergency board meeting directly inside the hangar that same evening, insisting that Rowan attend in person as well. Vivian assumed Rowan had been summoned to beg for a partial settlement, and she walked into the meeting still carrying the same dismissive posture she had shown him from their very first encounter. Once the doors closed, however, Thaddeus invited Rowan to sit directly across from the chief executive and placed the entire stack of evidence squarely on the table between them. The boardroom fell quiet the moment Thaddeus closed the door behind him, the kind of silence that made every small sound, a shifting chair, a cleared throat, feel unusually loud. Several board members who had never met Rowan in person studied him carefully, trying to reconcile the calm, plainly dressed man in front of them with the elaborate villain Vivian had described in her earlier phone calls. Rowan did not attempt to fill the silence or perform any version of righteous anger for the room. He simply set his folder on the table, squared its edges once out of habit, and waited for someone else to speak first. Vivian tried initially to steer the conversation her own direction, accusing Rowan of applying unlawful pressure and deliberately disrupting normal business operations. Rowan did not respond with emotion or accusation of his own. Instead, he walked the room through a precise timeline. The day he first discovered the concealed prior damage, the day Dorian asked him to leave it out of the official record, the day Vivian demanded the interior redesign, the day Dorian approved the additional charges in writing, the day every ground test was successfully completed, and finally the day Vivian tore the invoice apart and refused to authorize final inspection. Each accusation she raised against him was answered by an email, a photograph, or a signed record sitting directly in front of the board. Thaddeus asked Rowan what would happen if he, as chairman, simply signed the return to service authorization himself at that very moment. Rowan told him plainly that he did not hold the authority to do so, regardless of his position within the company. Vivian offered Rowan a personal check on the spot, hoping to end the entire matter immediately and privately. Rowan told her the issue had moved well beyond a simple payment dispute, and that, before he would sign anything, Blackthorne needed to settle the outstanding balance in full, pay the contractual penalties tied to the delay, formally withdraw every threatening letter sent by their attorney, confirm in writing that he had played no role in the pilot's independent decision to refuse the flight, permit an independent party to observe the final inspection process, and open a formal investigation into Dorian's attempt to conceal the aircraft's original damage. Vivian's anger flared again, insisting that a mechanic had no standing to place conditions on a chief executive. Thaddeus cut her off firmly, reminding her that Rowan was not inventing new conditions out of thin air. He was simply enforcing terms she herself had already agreed to and signed months earlier. The board soon uncovered that Dorian had planned to withhold Rowan's final payment well before the project was even complete and had already begun drafting a fabricated report designed to blame the entire delay on Hale Aero Restoration. When confronted, Dorian attempted to shift responsibility onto Vivian, claiming she had personally instructed him to squeeze the price down by any means necessary. Their mutual finger-pointing, playing out in real time in front of the full board, exposed just how corrosive the company's internal culture had become over the years. Thaddeus offered Rowan additional compensation in exchange for keeping the entire episode quiet, an offer Rowan declined without hesitation. He did not ask for Vivienne's removal from the company, nor did he request any position of influence within Blackthorn's leadership structure. His demands remained exactly what they had been from the very beginning: fair payment, an accurate record, and assurance that no one on the flight crew would face retaliation for refusing an unsafe departure. His unwavering composure throughout the entire meeting made Vivienne appear smaller with every passing minute, even seated within the walls of her own company's boardroom. By the meeting's end, the board voted to suspend Vivienne's direct authority over the aviation division, while a formal investigation proceeded. Dorian was escorted from the building that same night and asked to surrender all company equipment before leaving the property. Thaddeus personally authorized full payment to Hale Aero Restoration, releasing the funds before the meeting had even fully adjourned. Rowan, however, still had not signed the aircraft's completion documents, explaining that the payment satisfied only part of Blackthorn's obligation. The Gulfstream still needed to pass one final, complete inspection before it could be legally certified to fly again. The following morning, Rowan returned to the hangar, accompanied by his technical crew and an independent inspector brought in specifically to observe the process. He had no interest in dragging the inspection out longer than necessary, simply to humiliate Vivienne further, so he moved through each required step exactly as the protocol demanded, reviewing every maintenance log in sequence, cross-checking component serial numbers against the original repair records, testing cabin pressurization under controlled conditions, verifying flight control response, running the engines through a full diagnostic sequence, confirming vibration data against expected tolerances, and re-examining the section where the hidden crack had once threatened the entire airframe. Vivienne stood outside the hangar and watched the man she had once dismissed as a desperate mechanic coordinate dozens of specialists with quiet, practiced authority. No one asked for her opinion at any point during the process. Mara told Vivienne directly, without softening the message, that the flight crew had never been trying to betray their employer. They had been protecting the passengers, the company, and, whether she wanted to admit it or not, Vivienne herself. It slowly became clear to Vivienne that her entire staff had not sided with Rowan because he held more power than she did. They had sided with him because, when it truly mattered, he had proven himself far more trustworthy. She approached Rowan privately and offered a quiet apology, hoping to resolve things without further public discomfort. Rowan told her that a private apology could not undo a humiliation that had been delivered publicly, in front of her own board and staff. Vivienne was ultimately required to walk into the hangar, standing before the assembled technical crew and flight staff, and acknowledge openly that Hale Aero Restoration had fulfilled every obligation exactly as promised. She confirmed that the delay had never been Rowan's fault, that her decision to withhold payment had been wrong from the start, and that the flight crew had acted correctly by refusing to fly an aircraft that had not been properly cleared. The admission did not transform her into a different person overnight, but it marked the first time in the entire ordeal that she had been forced to genuinely answer for her own choices, rather than deflecting blame onto someone with less power than herself. Later that same day, Avery called her father after reading Blackthorn's official public statement acknowledging the dispute and its resolution. She told him she felt proud, not because he had defeated a powerful executive in some dramatic confrontation, but because he had refused to become like her in order to win. Rowan listened quietly, told her he loved her, and reminded her to get some sleep before her early class the next morning. Exactly the kind of ordinary conversation the two of them had shared throughout the entire ordeal. Rowan completed the final inspection late that afternoon, checking every remaining item against his own meticulous standards one last time. He picked up his pen and stood in front of the signature line that had remained empty for an entire tense day, while every pilot in the hangar waited in complete silence for what would happen next. Rowan signed the return to service authorization only after every technical, contractual, and safety requirement had been fully and verifiably satisfied. Mara was the first to climb into the cockpit, settling into the seat with the quiet confidence of someone who finally trusted the paperwork in front of her. None of the pilots who had once refused to fly the aircraft celebrated the moment, or mocked Vivienne for what she had been forced to admit. They simply returned to their positions because they now knew without doubt that the record sitting in front of them could be trusted completely. Vivienne was not permitted to use the aircraft for her original business trip as planned, since the board had temporarily restricted her authority over the aviation division pending the outcome of the internal investigation. Thaddeus instead asked Mara to conduct a brief verification flight with only the essential crew required for the test. Rowan stood at the edge of the runway and watched the Gulfstream accelerate down the tarmac and lift smoothly into the afternoon sky. This was never a moment about one mechanic forcing a billionaire to beg for forgiveness in front of an audience. It was the culmination of 6 months of relentless labor, thousands of careful technical decisions, and one father's quiet refusal to let his integrity be purchased at any price. Rowan received the full outstanding payment, along with the contractual penalties owed for the delayed settlement. Hale Aero Restoration went on to secure a wave of new contracts in the following months, earned entirely through its reputation for precise, honest work, rather than through any connection to the very public dispute that had briefly consumed the industry. Mara was granted formal, independent authority over safety decisions across the entire Blackthorn fleet, a role the board created specifically in recognition of how she and her crew had handled the crisis. Dorian was terminated permanently following the conclusion of the internal investigation into his conduct. Vivienne retained her title as chief executive during the initial phase of the inquiry, but she operated for months afterward under close board oversight, stripped of the unilateral authority she had once wielded over the aviation division without question. The board additionally mandated a company-wide policy protecting employees and outside contractors who raised legitimate safety concerns, ensuring no one else would face the kind of pressure Rowan had endured simply for insisting on doing his job correctly. In the months that followed, the story of what happened inside that hangar traveled quietly through the private aviation world, passed along not as gossip, but as a kind of cautionary lesson about the difference between owning an asset and understanding it. Other executives, hearing second-hand accounts of the standoff, began asking their own maintenance providers more careful questions about documentation and sign-off procedures, unwilling to risk a similar embarrassment. Mara found herself fielding calls from chief pilots at other companies, curious how her crew had managed to stand united under such intense pressure from their own employer. She always gave the same answer, that it had never felt like a difficult decision at all, only the obvious one, once the paperwork made the risk impossible to ignore. Rowan, for his part, never gave interviews about the dispute and declined every request to speak publicly about Vivienne or Dorian, preferring instead to let the finished aircraft and its clean safety record speak for themselves. Avery later admitted that some of her classmates recognized her father's name from articles about the standoff, and that she found herself oddly proud, explaining that he had simply refused to sign something he could not stand behind. Several weeks later, Rowan returned to his hangar early one morning before the rest of his crew arrived for the day. On his desk sat a photograph of the Gulfstream cutting cleanly across the California sky, along with a handwritten letter of thanks signed by every member of the flight crew who had stood beside him throughout the ordeal. He did not frame the settlement check, and he did not print out any of the news coverage that had briefly surrounded Blackthorn's very public dispute. Instead, Rowan hung a copy of the completed inspection record, bearing his own final signature on the wall above his workbench, where he could see it every morning before the first tools came out, a small daily reminder of exactly what the previous 9 months had cost him, and confirmed about the kind of work he was willing to put his name behind. Beneath it, in his own plain handwriting, he had added a single line that summed up everything the past 9 months had cost him and everything they had ultimately proven true. An aircraft should only ever leave the ground once the person responsible for it can sign their name without having to lower their head.